I would say, the security that's required for those kinds of records. And we're going to talk about that pretty much the whole class. Okay, moving on. Oh, so this class was originally November 1st, 2016. I didn't go back, into time, and so we are actually at March 26, 2019. Didn't want to confuse anybody. Okay, so I have a royal proclamation to make because we are talking about security. So today's class establishes the justification for your new assigned title. I'm giving you all a new title, believe it or not. And that's called Records Risk Managers. Because in essence, that's really what you are. You are the custodian of the records, and you need to make sure, either by doing it yourself, but typically within the organization, that the records are secure. And if any breaches take place, you are knowledgeable that it has taken place, and not 2 years later when you eventually find out that records have been breached. So, Records Risk Manager, how do you get acceptance of your new title? Okay, you can say that the King of RMU anointed you with the title and asked for a raise, which probably won't happen. Or there's different ways of promoting this idea. Monetize it, okay? Demonstrate how reducing, records risk access reduces cost. Write an article about your new title and what that entails. You can change your email signature to include the title. Start a state or local organization or RRMs with bylaws and official duties, and announce a new part of the records management program, which is, more aligned with risk management. And as we've seen, risk management in all ways within most organizations is a top priority. They need to make sure that there isn't risk. They don't want to take financial risk. They don't want to take, production risk. There needs to be a point where they recognize that if you're having repositories of all these important assets, namely records, you want to minimize any risk with access to those records and how they're being used, and whether there's PII in it or personal identifiable information. All that is at risk, and the rules are becoming stricter and stricter with regard to that, whether in the commercial world or in the private sector, or in the public sector. Okay, let me just run through these, and bingo. Okay, so these are the classes that we've had so far, and now we're up to the fourth class, Secured and Unsecured Environments, and our last class of the semester, which we'll tell you a little bit more about as we get to the end, is on April 9th, 2 weeks from today. And then you can go on summer holiday. Okay, so in our last class, we had talked about, gathering your supporters. And so the question that we wanted everybody to, consider was, in your organization, who are your strongest records management supporters? And so we had 67 responses, which is really pretty good. I like that. And they responded to that question in the Faith Community group, online group. And so we broke them down as much as we could, and some people had multiple responses. So legal was the main supporter of the RIM program, which is not what do I say? It was not unsuspecting. Okay, the executive level, 9. Well, obviously they're important. And then compliance was 9. So they were the top tier. And when you look at that, you need to consider that within your own organization as to where do you go to get support for your program. And then we had the administrative staff, finance, and finally another, other 19. Some had 2 or more supporters. That's why it doesn't really add up to 67. And others were all over the place, which was good to see. I think there was one that said they had no supporter at all. So I'm not sure how they're accomplishing their efforts, but if they are, good for them. Let us know how you did that. Okay, so today's goals: protecting the organization's assets. And assets in terms of how we speak today are your records, whether they're physical records, electronic records, microfilm, microfiche, whatever it may be. those are the assets of the organization. If they're not assets of the organization, you make two determinations. One is, why am I saving them? Okay. And the other one is, do I get rid of them if they're not assets any longer? And that's the whole disposition of records that most programs require. Okay, securing records. How did we get here? How are we securing records, and what was a little bit of the history of that? We're going to talk about proactive security. We're going to talk about reactive security, secure records delivery. How is it pushed to individuals who need to look at the content? And then finally, technology modernization and its effect on record security. What is happening today in the world? We see this particularly in the federal government right now, where modernization is taking place because systems need to be sunsetted. Let's say the Windows Server is outdated, the database is getting outdated, and you're not going to just run with it because they create certain security breaches. And so modernization is both about technology and the products you're using as to where there's potential security risk. Okay, so the course words for today are record threat management. What do we mean by that? It's basically, I can let you read it, I don't have to read it for you. It's really protecting the unauthorized use of information and information systems. And it's governed, in effect, the unauthorized use by having proactive and reactive security methods that protect your information. And I'm going to really kind of differentiate the two in a few minutes. So going back to the inventor semester, I don't want to leave sight of that totally. We wanted to look at, and this was really one of my favorite semesters, because what we were looking at, that inventing things is a progression of prior invention science. Okay, so the car didn't just appear. Okay, there were a lot of things that had to be invented for a long period of time to allow the car to actually be assembled. Okay, you needed wheels, and that comes back to the Stone Age stuff. You needed a combustion engine. You needed something to drive it. You needed the energy to drive it. So a lot of stuff had to be invented before you could actually create the car. Records management is the same thing. It parallels this whole paradigm that some science or some inventions took place well before where we are today. Okay, and you know how you categorize things, how you had physical records, how, you know, as time has moved on, went into electronic records and this whole thing with email and so on and so forth. So you, as a records manager, potentially are inventors, because you're driving this maturing of the records management process. And in your organization in particular, you're the person typically that is most familiar with the different aspects of records management. You may not be totally in tune with all the technologies out there that or anything else, but you're going to have to keep reinventing your records management program. It does not become stagnant. There's new technologies that are coming back that generate records. We'll talk a little bit, and we have talked a lot about that in the last classes. But you know, the bottom line is things start simply. Again, you can't build the car if you didn't have wheels. You might be able to, be kind of hard. Then it becomes a boat, only when it rains a lot. But you know, you need these components. And if you look at something, you look at any invention, there's simplistic parts of that invention. So my example here is, if you can read it, it's a perpetual mousetrap from many years ago. And then through this history or this development, or this improvement process that takes place, people come up with different ideas. Sometimes they're not better, but it adds to the knowledge about doing something. It adds to the knowledge about catching mice, or it adds to the knowledge about how to do records management. So then it kind of got to this thing, and they came up with this very simple thing to capture mice. Now, I don't think most mice are attracted to the fake cheese that's there. No. I think somebody had to say, "Oh, this is kind of interesting," but you know what? I probably need to put real cheese there.
Mice are smarter than you think.
Absolutely. And then we had this crazy dude called Rube Goldberg, who came up with, you know, here's how to make something very simple to do something and make it really complex. And I'm going to suggest you kind of don't want to do that in records management. And then we got into more complex things where this is very interesting, but this is a mousetrap. And then we actually had a game about that.
I remember that.
Yeah, yeah. So so we learned early about inventions. So now we took that little Victor mousetrap thing and we embellished it with a lot more things. And so this is how progress takes place. And I truly want to establish the idea that you have to go through this progression from simple to more sophisticated. I'll use the word sophisticated versus complex. You don't want complexity, you want sophistication based on delivering one of the most complex things that an organization tries to adopt. And that's records management on an enterprise level. We talk to customers all the time, and every one of them, you see greater and greater complexity in their organizations in terms of having an enterprise type of solution. So my inventor du jour is a lady called Hedy Lamarr, which not her real name, that's her real name. And she was a celebrated actress with MGM many years ago. And Hedy was born around 2000, 1914 in Austria. And she became an actress and very well known. She did a lot of cool movies. I mean, I remember some of these, and that's sad. I remember most of these actors too. That's even sadder. But the thing that was amazing about Hedy was she co-patented the use of frequency hopping for controlling torpedoes in the 1940s. Okay, frequency hopping allowed for a more sophisticated and secret transmission of data as electronic signals. It was not used until 1962, though, and she did this in the 40s, in the U.S. blockade of Cuba. The technology, this is the cool thing, the technology later became the foundation for spread spectrum technology. Basically, it's the basis for digital communications using Bluetooth, Wi-Fi, and incorporated into cell phones, faxes, and other wireless technology. So here's this, beautiful actress, okay, that came up with this. So her comment about things are very interesting, and I'm putting one of them out there. I hope it doesn't offend anybody, but this is from her. Any girl can be glamorous. All you have to do is stand still and look stupid. Obviously, that's not what she did. Okay. She was glamorous without standing still and looking stupid, and she was brilliant and did a lot to contribute. And she was just one of the 6 inventors that we explored back then. But she, again, looked at something differently, even though she wasn't part of that environment, and came up with a very interesting idea. And it's the same thing that we do in records management. We try to come up with good ideas. So from that perspective, we look at, what was the security? How did we come to where we are today in terms of records management security? So we all recognize this. This is kind of the security. You had an office, this is before cubicles. Everybody in an office, I think, at one time. And your papers were just out there. If somebody got into your office or is just walking around and they're looking in your office, they could see something. If anybody of you who has gone to a doctor's office, okay. The interesting thing about doctor's offices, the whole idea of HIPAA, okay, and securing information and not exposing somebody's records to somebody else. Well, it's not a great practice because you can go in there and they have you sign into a book or a sheet of paper your name and your appointment. So if somebody comes behind you and recognize your name, that's not very secure. I've been in situations, I'm sitting there in the doctor's office, and the previous patient's records were up on the screen. So, we don't do this purposefully, but there are many times that we're allowing the exposure of records that should not have that exposure. And we have to always be conscious of this, because if we don't do it at this level, the more sophisticated levels where you have real true cybersecurity breaches and stuff, people forget about that. So we have to be diligent in our efforts to promote the idea. And you as records managers need to do this in your information governance groups or your senior executives. These records are important assets of our organization. Please pay attention to it. Okay, so then we got to the point where, we won't leave them on desk, we'll lock them in a drawer and we'll have a key and I'll have the only key to it. And then when I leave the organization, I got to remember to leave the key there or they're going to have to break open the safe. All right, then we decide, okay, drawers aren't big enough. We have too much paper. We're going to go to the warehouses and let the people like Iron Mountain and everything be the custodians of the security of those records. But when we're transferring those records, there's an exposure there. We're putting them in a truck. It's going somewhere else. Do I trust the driver of the truck not to take the record? There's a lot of security issues when you're dealing with paper. Then we got smart. We said, okay, let's scan the documents, and we'll have electronic versions, and then we can destroy the paper once we qualify it that we've actually captured it. Kept progressing. We kept getting better because the technology got better. We couldn't do this without computers, and then we couldn't do it without scanning devices. And then we got to the point and say, I don't want to store it locally. I'm going to go up in the cloud because the cloud's more secure, and it's more secure because the people who are running those clouds have multiple customers. And when Microsoft puts out an announcement of an updated version, everybody gets that version. It's controlled. And we have, people at clearances levels, depending on what kind of clouds you're working in, that can take care of it. And then we got to the point where, the cybersecurity needed to play in. Digital footprints and digital evidence needed to be done. But when we did that, we found, there's kind of wormholes and ways to get around the firewalls to get at that information. And so we still have these continual challenges. And then we got the brilliant idea that, I don't need my computer locked in my office or in the organization. You know what we're going to do? We're going to give access to all our information over cell phones. All right. And so you had all these different manufacturers coming out with cell phones, but the security on the cell phones wasn't that great. We know it's gotten better. We know the things with Apple where people could not get into the cell phones, that the Justice Department wanted them to get into the cell phones. So the security has gotten much, much better. But the security in terms of walking away from information, it's not very secure. And the idea here is that with a jump drive, you can really get a lot of information. And that information can be very explosive. So we need to get to a point where we're protecting this information. So now we've kind of come full circle, though, and we're getting to the point now we're going back to locking the information up, okay? And that relates more to physical records. How do we control that information? And so what we've seen, particularly in the last couple of elections, is state election officials are returning to paper ballots, okay, to prove it out, to make sure that it's safe, that there's no collusion, corruption, whatever you want to call it. So there's been a number of articles that have been written about this. And so what we see currently is in 19 states, they're going back to paper ballots. Okay, so these states have spent an enormous amount of money buying technology, the electronic technology, which is more costly than the paper. All right. But the concern is breaching those systems and influencing, the elections, because you can't tap into every ballot that's paper ballots. So now they're saying, okay, I guess we see, particularly in the last elections, that this stuff can be breached. So now we're taking that, we're going along, and now we're turning that back into the ballot box. Kind of interesting. We're going back in history.
Are the Chads back? I remember the Chads.
Yeah. Well, that's it. Then you have that too, because you punch the Chads and you get the exact record and how's that. It's about information and looking at that information and not saying one methodology is the right methodology for all of our information and protecting those records. So basically, the word, whatever, not the word puzzle, whatever they call these things.
Infographic?
Infographic, yeah, there's a particular term for it. Maybe somebody will text us what that is. Not text us, but chat it. But here's where you fit in, okay? You're protecting and securing the risk of your records in your organization. And I'm telling you right now, none of your other individuals in that organization are looking at records the way you do. Okay, that's why you're the records manager. You have to kind of step up, learn about a lot of this stuff, be familiar with it. You're not going to be experts on it. Okay, we all learn a little bit more every day. I learn more every time I do these kind of presentations. I do a little bit more reading, a little more research. And what we're presenting to you today is a compendium of different things to think about. I can't go into detail on all it. There's a lot of information to depart to you, and just consider this as a reference presentation. All of the presentations are of that ilk because we can't go into it, but it gives you ideas. It gives you these reference points that you can go back to. And so when you're going to the executives, or you're in the information governance group or whatever, you have this kind of familiarity and awareness, because again, you are the custodian of the records. You can't say, oh well, there was a security breach and I knew nothing about it. There needs to be mechanisms in there so you're participating in this and understanding what's going on.
And so thank you to many of our participants who pointed out that is a word cloud.
Oh, it worked there. Thank you. I
always get a lot of responses on that.
There's certain things that no matter how many times you hear it and do it, there's certain things that just don't make sense to you in your brain, and you kind of lose it. So yes, word cloud, very good. Thank you all. You're listening. I think I did that to see if anybody was on.
Oh, they were listening.
Okay, good.
Very quickly.
So security lifecycle management. We've had this slide up. I do it on every presentation because I think it's an important slide. So basically, what's happening is this whole life cycle has aspects of it and intrusion points where content is either not secured or is subject to a potential breach. And so what we look at is the information capture side is really the proactive side. And that's what we're going to talk about first. And how do you protect the information as you're actually collecting it? And what are the things that prevent breaches and so on? I'm not going to go into a lot of detail for cybersecurity. That's a whole different world. It's part of the front end of things, but I won't spend a tremendous amount of time on that. You don't need to be expert. So the proactive stuff then becomes reactive as it's into the system, and it's living and breathing for a period of time as it's going down its records management cycle. Okay, so who are the actors that threaten us? Okay, there's trolls and there's bandits, and they are different. So my introduction to trolls was basically from a Billy Goat's Gruff book many, many years ago when I was a child. I think I still read it. But trolls the impression of trolls was negative. Okay, they were bad dudes or bad dudesses, whatever you want to call them. And so the idea of troll now, particularly in cybersecurity, are the folks, okay, that want to invade your system through the internet. I mean, if we didn't have the internet, this would not be such a big idea, and they really didn't exist. Technology trolls did not really exist before the internet. And most of them are malicious. They're trying to get in to do something. And some of them are benign actors, okay? And what I mean by that is they're just kind of out there. They just want to see if they can break in. They have like 4 friends, and let's see who can break into this system the fastest. They don't steal anything. They don't do anything, but it's still illegal what they're doing. But they're very benign in terms of taking your assets. And then my introduction to bandits was Zorro. And, I would assume a lot of you are familiar with Zorro. So a bandit really is somebody inside the castle, okay, that can get at the information because they're a legitimate resource in the organization. But typically they have malicious intent, but not always. That's why I said Zorro. Zorro was a good guy. Stole from the rich, gave to the poor. And so all bandits are not bad, but in this particular case, in terms of what we're talking about, acquiring records and stealing the records, yes, a bandit typically has malicious intent. All right, so I love this. Is one of my favorite questions. It's probably my second favorite questions, opposed to when does a record become a record? And my next one, and this is what is more secure, a digital or a physical record? And I usually get very good responses from records managers. Other people, not so much. But here's why. Okay, if I had physical records all the time, 2,500 printed pages per box. Okay, how am I going to move those boxes? How am I going to steal all of those boxes? I'm not going to make copies of all this information. I'm going to bring my shopping. I just went to the Giant. I bought my food. Now I'm going to go and I'm going to take the records and put them in boxes. Ain't going to happen. But when we look at the bandits, okay, that have gotten into your systems, all right, this is what they can take on a 2 terabyte jump drive. Tremendous amounts of information. And it's easy. And then if they have 2 or 3 or 4, they're taking all the data typically that could be in an organization very, very easily. Now, this requires you to get into the organization with the jump drive, which is not always easy. It's almost impossible in the federal government, although it happens. But then we have the online folks. You don't know what they're stealing, how much they're stealing, because they can get at everything if they can get into your systems. If you don't have the right security and permissions, and you don't have a tracking method that alerts people that they're stealing the records. And this is part of the problem when you've heard that tremendous numbers of records have been stolen. You think, how could they steal that much information? Doesn't anybody kind of have oversight to this and say, oh, wait a minute, something's getting triggered? And we're going to talk about this.
I've even seen a lot of government organizations remove jump drives or
Yeah.
USB ports. So
on their computers.
On the computers themselves, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. But with Bluetooth transmit, heady stuff.
Right.
There's all ways to transmit that stuff internally, and it's tricky.
Yeah.
Okay, so you don't want to be part of this whole security, the crashing the technology, and so on. So what I want to show you now is one of my favorite slides, and let's see where I have that. Whoops, sorry. I'm going to back up, and let's go here, and I'm going to bring this up. Give me a second. I couldn't meld it into the presentation, so I have to do this a little bit more manually than I would like. But I think it's important to see this. This is a site, and we will send you, we're going to put the link up in
the community forum.
In the community forum. Let me kind of open this up a little bit here. So this tracks all the different breaches, and these are typically external breaches and data hackers that get into systems. And it really shows a history, an important history, of breaches over the years. Okay, this goes back to 2009. A lot of breaches, but the size of the breaches weren't as big as they're starting to get. And as time goes on and we get more sophisticated in our ability to protect the information, there's still a tremendous amount of breaches that take place. So if I go over to Marriott Hotels, it tells me a little bit about what took place. Chinese resume leak, which is kind of interesting because it's breaking into the Chinese. And the Twitter leaks, and a lot of these things you've heard of, and a lot of these have been in the news. And it goes to the present day in 2019. You can also filter at this site. Ooh, I think I hit the wrong thing. Let's go back. Oh, I know what I did. Let's do this. Okay. You can also go and filter. So if you're trying to make a case within your organization that we need to make sure that our records, our assets are protected properly, you can go in and you can say, okay, how much in the financial industry? And it'll break that down for you. We all know a lot about the Equifax one that's taken place. And again, it shows you the history over a number of years of those breaches. So you can take any of the environments that you're in, whether it's government, it's gaming, it's energy, and they can show you the kind of breaches. And it's a tool you can use to promote that idea, the RRM, and say, I'm important into this process. I want to make sure you're aware. And they're going to say, yeah, we're aware, but they sometimes aren't aware to this level. Okay. All right. And it doesn't take a genius to recognize that all records are vulnerable. Everything can be breached. And if somebody tells you we have the perfect answer to breaching data, they don't. All right. We're going to talk about a couple ways of protecting the data better, but there's no way to make any record totally secure. Like some of these geniuses. Where's my picture?
Yeah. Not in the top right-hand corner.
Yeah, that's if I take off my hat, that's what I look like. This is Einstein's wife. This is Ben Franklin. This is Madame Curie. You know who that is, right?
Ray Charles.
No.
Oh, Stevie Wonder.
Stevie Wonder.
That was close. That was close.
Da Vinci and Einstein. Very, very famous geniuses. Okay, so where do we start? Okay, a lot of what we talk about is perimeter security, or the security that protects your internal networks from the trolls. Okay, but the problem is, as we've talked about, what if they can climb? What if they can get over the fence? What if they can get over the firewall, or through the firewall, or under the firewall? How can we protect our information? So we have insider threats and outsider threats. What's the greater cybersecurity threat? What do you think, Chris? Insiders or outsiders?
I insiders.
All right, let's see what the let's see what the board says. Okay, so 52% are social engineering, 40% are insider threats, and 39 are the advanced persistent threats. We're really going to concentrate on the 40%, even though it's a lesser percentage. These are the things that worry people the most because they're the inside people that are getting at the information. And we can still build better firewalls and cybersecurity, but it's hard to build protection against people who have permission to get at that information. Okay, so social engineering, I'm not going to read this. I use this as reference from this group Guardian, and basically social engineering attacks are fooling users or employees into handing over confidential or sensitive data. It's basically you get this email on a personal basis that says, okay, somebody has breached your bank account. We need your bank account number. We need that, or even on the phone, or whatever the case is. And they're doing this all the time because obviously what they're trying to do is get specific information about you so then they can go in and attack your accounts. Okay, so it's a large percentage of it, and I just want to make you familiar with that. It's basically just called social engineering attacks. The other one, the 39%, advanced persistent threats. Basically, it's computer network attacks on a constant basis, and is traditionally associated with state sponsorship. And I don't mean states in terms of the United States and our 57 states, isn't that how many we have? Anyway, it's the Chinese government, it's the Korean government, or North Korean government. So they are the states that's talking. It's also the persistent threats are interesting when you look at things like the energy grids. They're banging that thing all the time because if they have control, foreign actors have control of our energy grids, I mean, it's all over. And that's one of the biggest threats that exists for the United States and for other worldly countries. Okay, so we're going to get back to our 40%. You're familiar, I'm sure most of you are familiar with folks like Edward Snowden, the NSA, and Chelsea Manning in the DOD, and those people had access to that information, legitimate access. What do you do to protect the information? So we're going to talk a little bit about proactive ways and reactive ways to protect your organization's assets. So I got a lot of them here. I'm going to go very quickly through it, or we'll never get through this. Basically, you got to start with a security plan. What is that plan? Who established that plan? Are you participating in it? Because they're not thinking about records. They're just thinking about the data maybe in their HR system or the data that's in their financial system that somebody's going to steal. Okay, but you have the other assets that are not in those transaction systems, and that's really called records management. Credentialing, identity management systems, and the integration of that, where it says who you are, what you are, where you are. And so there is a link when somebody wants to look at records to these systems to make sure that they are seeing the records they're entitled to see. You have authentication and authorization. So let's flip this real quick and look at authentication. These are a bunch of terms. They may or may not be familiar to you. But these are a way to authenticate the user. If the biometrics, let's say, that can look at your fingerprint, your eye color, or the makeup of your eye, or basically your passwords, everything that allows you to get into the system. That's really what authentication is. Are you who you say you are? Now, there's problem with authentication if you have, let's say you don't have timeouts on your screen and you go to lunch, somebody else can go in and access information, okay, and they're going to think it's you. So sometimes they do other things. There's something called two-factor authentication. We talked about that, I think, in last class, where now with your bank accounts and everything else, you can go in, you put your password in, you put all your credentials in, and then basically send you a text message or an email with some code, and you enter that code, and then that's when you get in. That's becoming bigger and bigger. So I'm not going to go through a lot of these in detail, but these are words you may hear in terms of authentication. And then obviously authentication isn't the last step. So there's this kind of post-authentication that takes place, and that's basically authorization. And authorization really considers things like document permissions. Who can get into, let's say, the file cabinet, and in the file cabinet, what records are they allowed to see? And this is a setup in most systems, and it's a very important setup. Classifications, and again, we've talked about this, classifications are not categorizations. Classifications are top secret, secret, SCI. There's a number of different classifications depending on who you're working for, particularly in the federal government, DOD, intelligence community, and other parts of the organization. Supplemental markings, attribute-based access control. These are things that records management products, certain ones have gone through certifications that prove out this, that prove out that if Chris is Chris, and Chris is located in India right now, Chris has certain access to certain types of documents. When Chris moves from India to England, let's say, he loses that right to see that information that he was allowed to see in India. So there's this combination of properties against Chris, against documents, against location that basically gives you a little higher level of permission and access rights. We're going to talk about data segmentation. There's encryption that takes place, encrypted emails. There's encryption that in effect takes place when you're transmitting, let's say, your credit card number over the internet. If you have a vendor that has incorporated that into their purchasing site, and a lot of people use third-party purchasing sites so that information is encrypted and protected. Okay. Let's go back to our proactive ways, controlled unclassified information and PII. We've talked about this, that kind of information we got to look at as, let's say, emails come in. We need to find those documents and decide what we want to do if it has PII. You don't want to just take it all in, put it into your records management system without some kind of cleansing or identifying it with permissions. Supplemental markings, talked a little bit about that. That was the triangular thing with Chris in India and so on. Encryption and SSL. If you look at the URL when you're in your web browser, it used to always be HTTP and it stopped. Then they added the S for the secured socket layers, which adds a layer during transmission that protects that information because people can tap the in effect the lines, the transmission of that information and steal that information. So if you're sending your credit card number over the internet, you want to make sure it's it's HTTPS. There's no guarantee, but it'll throw another layer on that and encrypt that information for you. Content security, exposure on ingestion. What do you do as secure information comes into the system and you need to categorize it? Do you categorize it as it's coming in? Do you categorize it later on? If you categorize it later on, there's a time period in which there's a potential security breach because that's open before the categorization takes place and the properties are set that this is a classified document or this is a secure document. All right, a couple more on the proactive side, having the key to the castle repository. Typically in most systems, there's a high-level administrator who has, total access to things that are going on in the system. The problem that you have there is they can get at anything. There's no oversight. So you need to have processes in place that somebody doesn't really have the key to the castle without any oversight. Minimizing cobbled solutions. So if you're buying a records management solution, and it's a product that has been what I call cobbled together by different vendors' products, there's a higher potential for a security issue because the company who's delivering it may not know all of that because they purchased this product from somebody else. Vulnerability scans basically looks at your information when you bring it in. So if we're delivering our product to, part of the DOD, before it ever gets put on a server, it needs to go through vulnerability scans to make sure that there's no Trojans in there or bad elements that expose that server. On-premises versus cloud, talked a little bit about that already in terms of the benefits of the cloud infrastructure, but there's also benefits for the on-premises if you have the right kind of security that you need. We've seen in particularly the intelligence community that at one time they would never even consider going to the cloud, an external cloud. Now they will, because they understand that things have been done to better harden those systems and have access to those systems. 13, separation of data and objects. If you take your data and you take your Word document or you take your spreadsheet or your PDF or whatever that's associated and you put them in, one structured data source, okay, like the database with objects on it, it's easier to go in there and get at the database and take all that information. If you separate that out and you have a data store and you have an object store that really communicate with each other, you've added a wall of protection that wouldn't be there if you're storing everything in the database. And then finally, data and file chaining. I'm going to talk about this now. You've probably, most of you have heard of blockchain. And it's a digital record of transactions. And the interesting thing here, it's a ledger network that involves no centralized control. So data is spread out on 2 computers or 1,000 computers. And no one ledger has all the information about all the computers to assemble this stuff. And so each computer has a little bit of a ledger that knows that it's chained to another computer. And I get some of that stuff there. So you're finding that this technology applies in a lot of different areas. It applies in records, okay, where you're taking the data about the records and you can actually, you can split up the object if you need to as well. And so we're seeing this in all kinds of commercial space, in private space, in government, and so on, trying to figure this out and how it applies. Now, it's still confusing to a lot of people. It's confusing to me. I'm not sure how it all works. I grew up in an age of supercomputers many, many years ago that took this same mentality and said, you know what? If I have one processor, what happens if I take an application and I apply 10,000 processors to it? There were companies called Thinking Man Machines who did it, and several other ones. The issue there was you had to program it, okay, to take advantage of all these processors. Blockchain, you don't have to program anything. You don't have to program the application. You still have to do some work, but it knows how to spread itself over multiple. And Bitcoin is based on blockchain because, if you get into nefarious environments, you don't want to have one computer having all this information stored. And this is a challenge for the CIA and the FBI to track transactions in the darknet. All right. So blockchain is becoming more and more popular and more important in the world of security and protecting information. Okay. So we talked about proactive, and now we're gonna jump onto the reactive, which gives me a second to take a drink of water.
So just one comment from one of our participants.
I need good comments. I don't want to hear bad comments.
Says you're doing great.
Okay.
No, it just says it's important to be aware and differentiate between deliberate insider threats and then accidental, incidental, negligent insider threats.
We're going to talk about that in a second because the reactive stuff has to do with, okay, what happens when the resource or a resource has access to information? Do they stumble on information? Or is there something that they're attracted to? We're going to talk about that right now.
That was a good segue.
It was a great segue. Aren't there those things you ride? Aren't they called segways?
Yeah.
Okay, I just want to make sure I was, not out of tune with the modern technology. Okay, so we're talking about electronic record threat management, and we're going to get deep dive that a little bit more. Okay, what we're talking about, kind of going to that comment, are things like honeypots. And what a honeypot is, Winnie the Pooh, he had these pots of honey. And so that's kind of where this term comes from and how it's applied to the technology, is that you set honeypots out there. And one of them may be, here is the list of all the executive salaries, okay? Or here is our plans to go public. And they really aren't legitimate documents, okay? But what happens is with an auditing capability, you're seeing who is looking at these documents. They should never ever be looking at the shipping clerk is attracted to this honeypots because he wants to know everybody's salary. So these honeypots are put out there purposely to attract um, uh, the bad actors, the bad resources in your organization to look at this kind of information. Manual surveillance. Okay, so that's a reactive process. Somebody walks around, they're looking at people's screens, or their screen's up, there's information on that screen that shouldn't be on that screen, et cetera. So, that's not an easy thing to do. Not all organizations prescribe to or subscribe to the notion of Big Brother, but in certain organizations, it's kind of a necessary evil to protect, the government, protect, trade secrets and so on. Limited view access. This has to do with, okay, if I'm permission to look at information, okay, maybe I can only see the indexing values or the database metadata. Maybe I can see the database and the object. Okay, so it's broken up. Do I see nothing? Do I just see the database, or do I see the database and the object? And those are standard things that you should be able to set in your records management system as to what people can look at. All right. It also goes toward when we've talked about disposition. When I dispose of content, whether I'm accessioning it, I'm moving it, I'm destroying it, whatever the case may be, do I keep the database record that says I had this? And it doesn't have to be the total transaction, all the indexing values, but it says I did have it, I did destroy it, and I destroyed it because I was authorized to destroy it. So those things do play a role beyond just the security access component. So you need to be able to do that with your records management application. Sanitizing the repository into separate instances and networks. What you can do is not hold all your data on one server. And even if you separate your database elements from your object elements, you can split them up over multiple servers. Or if I have a billion records, maybe I don't have a billion records in one system. I set them off into different, and this goes kind of a little bit to the blockchain mentality. But what you need to be able to do when you do e-discovery, you need to cross those servers. You need to do what's typically labeled federated searches to make sure that when I do my research, I am getting all the elements that I need to deliver to somebody, to do a review, to give to legal, whatever. But this is a way that protects it because each server has different access capabilities, and you want to protect it if you do have these large repositories of information. I mean, another way of doing this is through basically leaving content in place. So let's say you had video, and you don't necessarily want to move all your video into a system, or maybe some other kind of you have drawings. It doesn't really matter. Size matters to a certain extent in this case, but it really doesn't. So what happens is you have a database server or two database servers, and they have all the indexing values, but they have pointers, they have URL links to this content. And so you're creating another wall of protection when you do something like that and splitting this information out. Let's get to the next one. Oh, there we are. Stress testing for unpredictable security exposure. And what I mean by that is, security is built and it's based on, in a lot of cases, the stress testing. Okay, what happens, if I'm sending the system up, I'm going to get 100,000 emails, and you test things out and you review it, and it seems like everything's working. Well, what happens if all of a sudden you have 500,000 emails coming in? Does that affect it? Is there some additional exposure there that you had not thought about? And it's basically something to consider. It doesn't come up that often, but you need to be aware that potential stress testing will expose a vulnerability within that system. Post-upgrade test script. I promote this all the time. I say, okay, you have a stable system now. You've tested something out. Everything is working. What happens when you do the upgrade? You should be able to take that same test script and run it against the upgrade that you just did. And that upgrade could be the database, it could be the operating system, it could be your security product and everything else. And you want to see, does the system behave the same way as it did previously? And that will expose some vulnerabilities if you do that. Most organizations don't do it. And it also goes toward predicting the stress testing too. All right. Before I could handle 100,000 transactions in a day, all of a sudden we did the upgrade, I can hardly do 50,000. What's going on? Where are things disconnected now? And they're just good technological approaches to managing this amazing system that you potentially have, and you're the custodian of that system. You can't defer everything to the IT group because they're not really in tune with a lot of the stuff that you're doing and that you need to do and that you need to protect. And then the 8th one is auditing dynamic dashboards and static reports. And so where this plays in, you're trying to audit the events that are taking place all the time. And you know, when I look at the Fife system, we may have several hundred events that can take place, and you can audit all those events. The problem is, how much data do you really need, and how much do you want to keep? Because that starts creating, you know, a lot of information that you have to store in the database. But you can always create a record from that as well. So we take this data and we start graphing it. And the reason we graph it is we want to see some patterns that are taking place in terms of accessing the system. So if I looked here at Kerman, I can go in here and say, okay, there is kind of a standard for the general user system in terms of how much information they're accessing on a daily basis. Okay, this is where we get to the real threat watch management that I talked about earlier. And so establishes a threshold by searching the auditor or the audit product. It reviews, you know, user activity for reasonableness based on roles. So Chris's role is to review invoices. Okay. So, and this is for the manufacturing of munitions. And so he goes in there, and every day, you know, he starts looking at 10 or 15 just to review them, see if they're legitimate, make sure we have all the detail about it from the manufacturer, everything else. Now, all of a sudden, he's looking at hundreds of them in a day. Okay. Nobody's going to know that, but the audit trail knows it. And that's very, very important information to establish reasonableness based on roles. And so you get a workflow notification of abnormal searching thresholds. So, you know, I'm Chris's supervisor, and all of a sudden I'm seeing this and I'm getting notified. I don't have to do anything. I don't have to go and search for this information. It's being pushed to me. And it says, you know, in the last day or 2 or 3 or within the last 5 hours, something is amiss here. And so it's my responsibility then to react to that. And so these audited events, active and static reports, are very important in determining these thresholds and the activity of the resources. So this is a particular view of, you know, a number of different individuals in the organization. These are the levels or the average counts. These are the standard deviations. You know, some of this math stuff is very intriguing, but for some of us.
Hedy Lamar here.
Hedy Lamar, that's you know, include administrative users and all that. So this is part of basically a combination of auditing information and workflow for notifications. Very important in terms of your system. So you have this whole process, thresholds established, data gets updated, values to see, you know, the threshold, investigation, escalation, reports are generated, and you want this as real time as possible, because if somebody's threatening your repository, you don't want to know 3 days later. You want to know as it's happening, and this can do it through dashboard processing. Okay, security record delivery, I'm going to top of the hour just about. What I may do, you know what I'm going to do, Chris?
What's that?
Give everybody a break. Oh. I'm gonna when we talk in our next class, I'm going to weave this back in there, because I think we're not going to be able to do it justice by kind of speeding through this. And I know people have a limited amount of time. So, I mean, I love this topic, but we're going to go through it. And then the other thing, I'll talk about modernization in the next class too, and how that's affecting this whole security and access, because it has changed and it will impact your organization. Okay. Okay, so we'll get to the next class homework. Should ephemeral communications or records be records? Um, I wasn't familiar with this term, ephemeral communications, until a couple years ago. It came and it went. I didn't understand. Ephemeral records are things like Snapchat and everything else that once I look at it, it disappears. Okay, it only lives for a very short period of time. And so, from a records management perspective, what is your policy, or what should you do, okay, about these records? Should you allow them? Should you not allow them in the organization? If you're going to do sexual harassment, and there's a lot of that, let's say, in certain parts of the military. I know the Air Force has had challenges with that, and then they had to produce certain records for Congress for the, I would say, inquiries, but they're inquisitions. This is important information because this is how you do it. Okay. And so how do you capture it? What do you want to do with it when you capture it? How long are you going to keep it? And this will, this goes back to this whole invention thing. This was not a problem before because this hadn't been invented. This hasn't, it's not discovered. This is invention. And so we want to make sure that we keep looking at these new technologies and trying to figure out how they're going to apply. And if you raise this question to your information governance group, in most cases, they will not have an answer. Okay, because they haven't thought about it, but you have, and that's important. Okay, so for the next class, what's on the agenda? Embracing the content information lifecycle and records. We're going to talk about the essential technologies, cobbling the effect of security a little bit more, the benefits of comprehensive ILM, information lifecycle management, records management platforms, and the liabilities. And so what we're going to look at is kind of this Venn diagram where it pulls together all these different technologies, which are all either independent of your records management system or tightly coupled to your records management system. And we're going to talk why that's important. Okay, so if there's any questions, you can start throwing them at Chris. He'll chat them to Chris. Who'll gather them. We'll do what we can to respond to some of them, depending on time. Okay, so here's my my usual 50-second marketing spiel to everybody. As everybody typically knows, we're a vendor, and but I think we're kind of different in terms of presenting this kind of information to you without shading it from a marketing perspective. We're trying to deliver to you the practical information that we've gathered, and not influence you in terms of a sales pitch. So the 3 keys to success, smart capture and categorization, and getting the information in and getting the right categories assigned to information, having an intuitive user interface. We've gone into situations that products needed to be sunset because the users couldn't use it. It was just too challenging. It was too cumbersome to assign categories. It was too cumbersome to do the disposition that was required for it. It didn't have some of the tools I was talking about in terms of tracking and auditing. So we believe we have a very special one that we can offer to you. And then it's a phased implementation. Again, it goes back to what I said about inventions. You got to phase this stuff in. You can't build the car the first time you think you need a vehicle to take you from California to New York. All right. And then you have, file shares and how you capture email, file share, SharePoint, legacy. These are all that front end of that information lifecycle that I showed you. These things have to be captured, and they have to be considered, and they have to be captured in a very efficient way. So, partner with Fife. This is what we can bring to the table, and we'll be glad to talk to you about it. Okay, questions and answers.
Yeah, just really one question so far. Just as we spoke about destruction of electronic files, but keeping documentation that the file actually existed.
Mm-hmm.
So would you keep the file folder but dump the content?
You could keep the file folder because the file folder, there's no real file folder. It is just, it's basically a data element in the transaction. It said there's a link to it. So if you look at a directory, the directory is a file folder, and you have subdirectories or sub elements underneath that, but you can keep the name of that folder, say, HR, or however granular you want to get that. And you can keep that and say, yeah, we had a folder about this. Okay, we had a folder about Chris. Okay, Chris is gone based on the rules of disposition, retention disposition schedule. I was allowed to delete him 7 years after he left the organization. We knew we had him. Here's some more data about him. Not much. You're not going to have your social security number. You have other things that are PII in there. but it will tell you that Chris was an employee of this organization.
Okay.
Okay.
Great. Other than that, no more questions.
No more. Why? Interesting. That's right. We are above the top of the hour. So again, we're going to mention our DC Live, which we will talk about some of these things. We're going to talk about modernization is a big focus on DC Live. I think we have 225 people that have registered so far. So if you're interested, please register sooner than later, because we are running out of room, which is a good thing, which is a bad thing. Okay, so we're kind of done. Next class, April 9th, Embracing the Information Lifecycle and Records Management, as I mentioned before. And I'm out of breath. Chris, close it up.
Yeah, just thank you, everybody, for participating today. We really appreciate your time. And spring is finally here, Mitch.
I know. I don't know if it's in Philadelphia yet, but the end of the week. The end of the week. Well, you're in Baltimore, so I think spring has arrived there.
That's right. So thank you, everybody, for joining today, and look forward to continuing the conversation with you all.